Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from. My name is Samantha Hung, and I'm the Chief of Gender Equality at the Asian Development Bank. So this event is part of ADB's International Women's Day and Gender Month celebrations, and we are thrilled to be hosting this conversation today with 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗆𝗲. To introduce Catherine, I would like to hand the floor to Mr. Bruno Carrasco, who is the Director General of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, to say a few words. Over to you, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Sam. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Last week's release of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, sixth assessment report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability made for sobering reading. Climate change is not something in our future, it is already happening, and it's a threat to human well-being and the health of our planet. The report makes it clear that to secure the planet's future, we must all act now. This message may feel overwhelming at times, but our speaker today has an important message to share. She has said that, quote, "We can't give in to despair. We have to go out and look for the hope we need to inspire us to act. And that hope begins with the conversation today," end quote. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗆𝗲𝗆, an accomplished atmospheric scientist studying climate change and why it matters here and now. She serves as the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, or TNC, an important civil society partner for ADB. Catherine has served as a lead author on the second, third, and fourth national climate assessments. She also hosts and produces the public broadcasting series, digital series on global weirding, and serves on advisory committees for a broad range of organizations, including the Smithsonian Nature History Museum, the Earth Science Women's Network, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Catherine has been named as one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people, Foreign Policy's 100 leading thinkers, Fortune magazine's World's Greatest Leaders, and the United Nations Champion of the Earth in Science and Innovation. She is the author of Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world, which the Guardian newspaper calls, quote, "one of the most important books about climate change to have been written," end quote. Catherine retains an academic appointment at Texas Tech University, where she is a Paul Whitfield-Horn Distinguished Professor and Endowed Chair in Public Policy and Public Law. She has a Bachelor of Science in Physics from the University of Toronto and a Master of Science and PhD in Atmospheric Science from the University of Illinois, as well as 2 honorary doctorates. We are privileged to have Catherine here with us today. Catherine, in the past, you've talked about how we cannot wait and that we must work to fix climate change with the people and perspectives we have right now. As Asia and the Pacific's Climate Bank, we are ready to heed this call along with all ADB staff across our region, working to support our developing member countries achieve an inclusive, resilient, and green future. Catherine, you have the floor.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be with you here today. I'm going to be speaking briefly on climate change, on how it affects women and girls, and how solutions to climate change can benefit us as well. While I'm speaking, I want to invite you to submit your questions because we will follow this with a Q&A. You can submit your questions using the link that was mentioned in the invitation, and if it could be put in the chat again right now so people could click on it, that would be great. The link is, let me share my screen so you can see it. The link is pollev.com/Catherine, pollev.com/Catherine. And at this link, at any time, you could enter your question. And here's the best part. You can see everyone else's questions and you can upvote the questions you most want us to get to. We will not have time to get to all of your questions because this is such an important topic and I know there's many things that you want to share. But even if you don't have a question, go ahead to pollev.com/Catherine. You don't have to enter your name, anonymous is fine, and look at the other questions people are asking, upvote the ones that you want us to get to at the end. So I am a climate scientist. I'm a climate scientist in a field where when I became a professor in earth sciences, 13% of earth science professors were women. Today, 25% of us are women, but it's not estimated that we will reach gender parity until the middle of the century. I am not only a scientist who studies earth science, I am also a climate scientist. And I know that climate change is an unprecedented experiment that we are conducting with the only home we have. As far back as we go in the history of our planet, we have never seen this much carbon going into the atmosphere this quickly. The biggest way that climate change is affecting all of us, no matter where we live, is by loading the weather dice against us. Wherever we live, anywhere in the world, it's as if we have a pair of weather dice and we always have a chance of rolling a double six. A hurricane, a typhoon, a cyclone, a drought, a flood, a storm, a heat wave. But as the planet warms decade by decade, it's as if it's sneaking in and taking one of these numbers and replacing it with another six, and then another six, and then another six, and even a seven. And so today we see that our droughts, which we've always had, are getting more intense. Our heat waves are getting more dangerous. Our wildfires are burning greater area. Our sea levels are rising. Our cyclones and typhoons are getting stronger and dumping more rain on us. We also are able to put numbers on just how much worse climate change made a given hurricane. We know how much more rain fell during the hurricane, how much more likely the floods were, how much stronger the heat waves were, how much greater area was burned by wildfires because of climate change. We can put numbers and even dollar signs on how much worse climate change is making these disasters. Why do these disasters matter? Because they affect us. They quite literally affect the quality and the availability of the water that we all depend on. They affect the air that we breathe. These changes affect the nutritional quality of our food. Plants that grow faster in a warmer, higher CO2 world have less nutritional content. And of course, they affect our crop yields as well. Our infrastructure, our roads, our buildings, our electricity grid, our water systems, all of these were built for a planet that no longer exists. Our planet's climate is changing faster than any time in the history of human civilization on this planet, and our civilization was not and is not prepared for these changes. Climate change is not a separate issue. If the only thing that were happening were the average temperature of the planet were increasing by 1 or 2 or even 3 or 4 degrees, but nothing else was happening, it would be a scientific curiosity. The reason we care about climate change is because it is at the center of the impacts that we see on our infrastructure, our economy, our energy, our water, our natural resources, our health, our food, our biodiversity, our conservation, and our issues of justice and equity. Climate change affects every single one of us. But it does not affect us all equally. Climate change affects women and girls, especially in low-income countries and low-income neighborhoods in high-income countries, more than it affects men. Climate change affects Indigenous peoples and minority populations more than it affects majorities. Climate change affects people of color. It affects different populations differently. And we see those impacts today. We see devastating impacts, like in Malawi, where child marriage was outlawed several years ago. Yet they see child marriages on the rise because when it's a matter of being able to feed your family or not, often families have no choice. These are the devastating impacts of stronger droughts, more variable rainfall, impacts on agriculture and water, on the most vulnerable among us. But just as climate impacts affect us all, but not equally, so too climate solutions can benefit us all, and they can benefit some of us more. Project Drawdown is a great resource that lists over 100 solutions to climate change. But my favorite solution out of all of the 100 that they list is this one: health and education of women and girls. As they say on their website, educated girls have higher wages, greater upward mobility, which contributes to economic growth. They have lower rates of maternal mortality. In other words, if you have a baby, you're much more likely to survive that, and your baby's much more likely to survive as well. They're less likely to be married as children. They have lower incidence of diseases like HIV, AIDS, and malaria. They can produce more if they're farmers. Their families are better nourished. You can see this is what we call a win-win-win-win-win-win solution. Education makes women and girls more resilient to face the impacts of climate change. It helps them be more effective stewards of food, soil, trees, water. They have greater ability to cope with shocks from natural disasters and extreme weather events. Oh, and the education of women and girls also would take out 85 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere. So many benefits. One of my colleagues, Catherine Wilkinson, who worked with Project Drawdown previously and who actually spells her name the same way I do, with 2 A's, she did a really wonderful TED Talk several years ago, which I love, and I want to quote some of that. She says, "Gender equity is a key answer to our global challenge. The primary link between women, girls, and a warming world is not life, but death. Climate impacts hit women and girls hardest. There's greater risk of displacement, of becoming a refugee, higher odds of being injured or killed during a natural disaster. As I mentioned, stronger, longer droughts can precipitate early marriages. Floods can force last resort prostitution as women struggle to make ends meet. But here's where the tide turns. Too often, she says, our story ends here, but not today. If we gain ground on gender equity, we also gain ground on addressing global warming, especially if we focus on empowering women farmers, providing education, and providing accessible and voluntary family planning." I serve as chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, and our projects in 76 countries around the world have a gender filter on them. We look for projects where we can empower women and girls, when we can empower Indigenous peoples, where we can empower the communities that are most impacted by climate change, so that they are most affected by climate solutions as well. And so I just wanted to highlight one of our many projects that's just such an encouraging project that relates to women, mangrove forests, and Papua New Guinea. So in Papua New Guinea, there are significant barriers to equality for women. None of their parliamentarians are women. 80% of men have physically or sexually assaulted their partner in their lifetime. Only 18% of girls are enrolled in secondary school, and there's 2% population growth. Those are huge challenges to women in PNG. But what we're doing is we're working with women together, not individually, but helping them build strong community groups that work together. We have a project called the 𝗞𝘁𝗵𝗵, and it is intended to help women work out how to best manage their mangroves, link women to markets for sustainable products like mud crabs, connect women across the country, and meet the needs they have to support themselves and their families. I want to share a few photos with you because I love seeing these pictures. Why do mangroves matter? They not only protect us against storm surge during typhoons, cyclones, and hurricanes, they protect our homes and our infrastructure, but they are also nurseries for fish and for many aquatic species that coastal economies depend on. They are also sources of firewood for local communities. They provide livelihood for women in terms of fishing and catching the mud crabs that I mentioned. And if you look down there, you can see she's taking a crab out of a trap down there. But in order to have this, we require healthy mangrove forests. They have to be managed in order to provide the firewood, the crabs, the fish, in a sustainable manner. And so that's why a big part of our project is helping women develop awareness within their communities of why it's important to manage the mangroves. Developing strong women groups who can do this work themselves based on what the shared understanding that they've developed in their communities. Developing new partnerships with organizations that can help, whether it's through tourism or other economic opportunities in the area, that also depend on healthy coral reefs, healthy coastlines, and healthy mangroves. And I love this part, involving young people in the effort and involving experts who can help, building those community connections. That's what gives us the strong projects that really truly make a difference in the community when they're led by the community. And developing new partnerships for financing, which is where organizations like ADB come in. These represent economic opportunities in areas of the world where traditionally there have not been these opportunities. And financing is a key part of these projects. Understanding and working with women at the community level is absolutely essential. You know that, we know that, and when this happens, that's when the results occur. So I love this final project for the 𝗵𝗿𝗶 𝗵𝗿. It not only supports the environment, but it's about women's economic empowerment. It's making us more resilient to climate change. It's making us more resilient to whatever socioeconomic shocks occur, and it is helping to advance the education and the empowerment of women in these communities. I know that ADB has many projects that also apply a gender filter. Projects like the Geothermal Power Generation Project in Indonesia, or the Vanuatu Energy Access Project that increases access to energy and especially renewable energy generation in 2 of the main islands. The Sustainable Development Goals represent very basic goals for every human on this planet. No poverty, 0 hunger, good health, quality education, gender equity. Down at number 13, we have climate action. But if it were up to me, I would actually take number 13 off the Sustainable Development Goals. Why? Because the only reason we care about climate change is because it affects our ability to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to provide good health and well-being, quality education, and to tackle gender equity. Climate change is not a separate bucket. Climate change is the whole in every other bucket. If we are going to ensure gender equity, we must tackle climate change. And that's why who we already are is the perfect person to care. Whatever we care about, whatever issue we're concerned about, climate change affects it, and climate solutions benefit it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for your insightful words and sharing your strong passion on such an important topic for us, and also sharing some of your own project examples from the Nature Conservancy, as well as relating it back to ADB. Now, I forgot to mention at the beginning that this event is actually jointly hosted by our Gender Equality Thematic Group, as well as our Environment Group and our Climate Change Group at the ADB. So we have several participants that are from these different areas in the bank, as well as broader areas of the bank. Plus, we also have quite a few external participants. So I would encourage you all to post some questions in the link that Catherine shared, or if you're having problems with accessing that, then please feel free to also post it in the regular chat, and we'll come back to that later. But I'm really excited now to move on to the conversation and pick up on some of what you're saying, Catherine. And this relates to one of the questions that's come through, and that's the issue of gender bias in science. You know very well that you are in a very male-dominated field, and there are only 122 women in the Reuters hot list of the world's top 1,000 climate scientists. We know that women scientists face lots of barriers, such as lower pay, less funding for their research, their papers are often cited less, and this matters because it affects their career growth. But we also know that the bias begins right at primary school, in the classroom, in terms of not necessarily being encouraged as much to study STEM. It also transfers into the work environment. For example, a study in 2020 found that 24% of 263 female scientists that were surveyed claimed to face workplace sexual harassment. So can you talk a little bit about your experience in the field and how you've dealt with gender barriers or any biases that you've personally encountered, and what needs to change to get more women and girls into science-related careers?
So there have traditionally been many barriers to girls going into science, just the cultural barriers. I remember when I first took a physics class in high school, and my friend said to me, "Why are you taking physics? Only boys take that." But today, the greatest barriers are not necessarily in the entry, but in the retention. It turns out that in the field of earth sciences in high-income countries where girls have access to education, it's almost, I'm not quite sure of the number, but I think it's about 45 to 55%. So 45% women entering the earth sciences to 55% men today, but they are not staying. And the reason they are not staying is because of the endemic biases in the system. Metrics like publication citations or the indices that we use to judge, the impact of a scientist's publications, those have been shown to contain gender biases. Everything from our teaching reviews can be biased. A colleague of mine in my department at my university who taught online classes, she conducted an experiment where she and the male instructor switched classes. The students didn't know who was teaching the class because everything they did was online, but they did it under each other's name. And they compared the teaching results, the teaching grades that they got from the students. There was a statistically significant bias against who they thought was the female instructor compared to the male one. A few years ago, they sent out a study to biology professors. They sent out a CV, a resume, of a person with a master's degree who was applying for the job of lab manager. And of course, what they did was they just changed the title and the name of the person so they appeared to be male or female. And then they asked the biology professors how competent they thought that person was, how likely they were to give them the job, and how much money they would offer them. It turned out that when the same CV had a female name, they were judged as less competent, they were less likely to be offered the job, and they were likely to be offered less money. And here's the tragic thing. Female faculty had the same biases. We are biased against ourselves. And so this is why we have a significant retention problem as well. And that means that there's no one solution. It's not just about encouraging girls to get into science and do STEM. We need solutions across the board to encourage girls to get into it, but then to keep them in all the way through.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those perspectives and those stories. It was really, really interesting. So we've got some good questions coming through. But as Bruno mentioned, our Director General, ADB has a very ambitious approach for both gender equality and climate change. And we needed to approach them in tandem, as you've suggested. So I'd like to ask you, often when we talk about climate as a gender issue, we get very different reactions. Some want to understand it better. Some don't see the connection, and you get a form of dismissal. So how would you recommend to approach this conversation when we need to convince the importance of tackling climate change, of course, but that gender inequality needs to be integral to that?
Mm-hmm. We don't have the luxury of tackling one problem at a time. We have to tackle as many problems as we can with the same solution. And as you probably could tell from my presentation, one of my favorite slides was where I talked through all the win-win-win-win-win-wins of educating women and girls in low-income countries. And then the very last win is that these actions actually end up reducing our carbon emissions. When we enable people to contribute to society, when we reduce infant mortality rates, when we improve the quality of people's health, when we give women choices, everyone benefits from that. So when we look at it as not a zero-sum game, too often people think, oh, well, my solution should be the one that we do, because this is the most important issue. We have so many important issues: poverty, hunger, lack of access to clean water, basic education, all the sustainable development goals. We don't have time to develop a customized solution to every single one of them. We need solutions that tackle all of them and build resilience to climate change at the same time. And the good news is those solutions are out there.
Thank you. So this is a good segue to this questions that come through on your 𝗶𝗶. It's clear that a project by project approach is not enough. So how do we scale up, and how do we move from demonstration to actual impact at large scale?
Yes. Well, first of all, pilot studies are of course important because researchers might have ideas of what might work, but until you implement an idea within a community, you don't know what the real challenges are, what the real solutions are. So let me actually give you another really interesting example from the Nature Conservancy in Africa. In Africa, they wanted to preserve the fish stocks in a key lake that was essential to providing basic protein for the communities who lived around it. So you would think, okay, the Nature Conservancy is a nature organization, so they're going to look at fish. And maybe they would replenish the stocks of the fish, maybe they would do some fish management. Well, through engaging with the community and following backwards, why do we have this problem? And then why do we have this problem? And then why do we have this problem? They discovered that the first step to maintaining healthy fish populations in that lake was providing dormitories so girls could continue their education, could stay overnight instead of having to travel because it was too far for them to travel. And when they reached puberty, they needed sanitary products. And that had to be supplied along with the dormitory. And so the first step to protecting the fish in the lake was providing the resources that girls needed to attend school. And that was like knocking over the first domino in a cascade of dominoes that led through an educated population that could establish its own principles of management of the fish populations. They could determine how to equitably allocate those resources. And as a result, the fish populations were now stable. So we have to do these pilot projects to figure out what the real solutions look like, but then we can scale them up, can't we? I mean, look at the microloan programs to women. Isn't that an example of where something small was done and then it was scaled up at the massive level? Look at the effort to reforest Africa. All of these projects started small, and then you figure out how you can do them, and then that's when you expand them to the larger scale, and we must be doing that at speed.
You. And I guess that's where the financing comes in as well, in terms of the ability to scale up. Okay, well, the questions are really coming through now, so we're trying to get through them, as many of them as we can. This is an interesting one. You talked a lot about empowering vulnerable communities, but actually it's the well-off that are contributing most probably to the climate challenge. So how can a multilateral like ADB have an impact on the behavior of the well-off?
Yes. The 3.5 billion poorest people in the world have caused 7% of heat trapping gas emissions. So the footprint of those of us who live in high-income countries is significantly larger, even if we live in a low-income neighborhood, than if we lived in a low-income country. At the same time, our level of concern is growing. So I live in the United States, where already 70% of people are worried about climate change. 83% of mothers are worried about climate change. 86% of young people are worried about climate change. I'm from Canada, where a larger percentage, about 75 to 78% of people are worried about climate change. And when you look at these numbers in other high-income countries in the UK, in Australia, in Europe, and beyond, we see high levels of concern. Many people want to do something about this. But going back to the US, since I have the best stats for the US, but I see this in my home country of Canada. I see this in the UK. I see this where I travel and speak in other high-income countries. Most of us are worried. Half of us feel hopeless and helpless and don't know where to start. And only a fraction of us, like 10% of us, are activated. So worried, feel hopeless, don't know what to do. What's the most important thing we can do is to empower people to act. Because individuals can make a difference. How? Not by focusing on our carbon footprint, our individual actions, but rather by focusing on how we have a climate shadow. We have a ripple effect as individuals. How does a system change? A system changes when people change it. Every single one of us is part of something that's greater than ourselves. We are each we could be part of a family. We could be part of a social group. We are part of a company or the business where we work. We are part of the neighborhood where we live. We're part of the city that we're in. We're part of the country, the state, or the province where we vote. Each of us has a voice, and each of us can use that voice to call for change wherever we are. And when you see a company that is taking significant actions to cut its carbon footprint, as many companies are these days, why did that happen? It happened because individuals in that company, typically not the CEO, use their voice to advocate for change to such an extent that the leadership had to listen and make that change. When you see a city making a change, it isn't typically because the mayor of the city was the person who decided to make that change. It's typically because citizens in that city called for change and voted for someone who would empower that, who would make that change. We see young people today, especially led by young women, using their voices to call for change. And believe me, making changes in our personal life is important too, especially in high-income countries. But the most important thing we can do is talk about those changes too. If I have reduced my food waste, can't the cafeteria at my university reduce their food waste? If I get my energy from clean sources, can't the company that I work for get their energy from clean sources too? If I have an electric vehicle, can't the fleet for my city also use electric vehicles? How do we implement changes? By using our voice to advocate for change. And the greater the ability we have, the greater the resources we have, the greater the responsibility I believe that we have.
Thank you. That's a really good segue for a theme that's coming through in some of these questions, and I might group a couple of them together. Mm-hmm. So one person is saying that they're a big fan of your work as a science communicator, and how do you use that to convince policymakers that climate change must be an economic development issue? And I guess a related question is, what are the gaps in terms of gaining political commitment from decision makers on addressing climate change?
Mm-hmm. Great questions. And those are truly, I believe, the trillion-dollar questions that you just asked right there. Can I just say, I love all these questions that are coming in. Thank you so much. Keep looking at them. Keep upvoting. So often the challenge is that we see climate change as a separate issue. So we might be concerned about poverty or development or energy access in energy poor areas. We might be concerned about empowering women or working on racial or gender equity. We might be concerned about the advancement of technology or sustainable farming or providing water or eradicating disease. So we think, here's all of these issues I'm concerned about. I think of them sort of like buckets that we're pouring all of our energy into, all of our time, all of our effort, all of our resources. And then, we've got this bucket of climate change at the end. Can't we just deal with that later? Climate change is not a separate bucket. Climate change is the whole in every single other bucket. To use a military term, climate change is a threat multiplier. We will never be able to fix any other problem we are trying to fix long term if we leave climate change out of the picture. And so if you want economic development, we have to tackle climate change too. If you want gender equity, we have to tackle climate change too. If we want to address energy poverty, we have to tackle climate change too. We have to build resilience to the impacts we can no longer avoid. And we also have to accelerate the transition to clean energy and the expansion of clean energy in places that do not have energy. And that's why I was so encouraged to see during COVID that 90% of new energy installed around the world during COVID was clean energy. The world is truly changing. That giant boulder of climate action is not sitting at the bottom of the hill with only a few hands on it. It is already at the top of the hill. It is already rolling down the hill in the right direction. It already has millions of hands on it. And if we add ours, it will go faster. And if we add levers, such as ADB, for example, is an organization that has some powerful levers it can add, that will go even faster.
Thank you. So again, I'm going to try to combine two questions here. So there's a question around actually, how do you measure the impact of addressing gender in climate change? And how do you avoid a sort of add women and stir kind of approach?
That is a great question. And I will first of all say that I do not know the definitive answer to that. But I do know that it has to be authentic. I myself have certainly been part of efforts where they're like, add the token woman, add the token, person. I was reading one of my colleagues' tweets just today, who was saying that she was quoting from a book, and it said that diversity often means that the more ways in which you're different from someone, the more committees you get put on. Because everybody just wants somebody to sort of tick that box. That's not authentic. Authentic solutions to addressing gender equity in communities begins with the community itself. It begins with listening to what the true barriers are in that community. It begins with brainstorming what real solutions would look like for that community. It continues with assessing, is this working? And asking the people who are most affected, is it working for you? And if so, why? And if not, why not? And then taking those lessons and applying them to other communities, because again, scaling up is so essential. And how do you measure that? There's no perfect metric, but there are certainly a lot of metrics that are abysmally low right now that we need to get up. What do those metrics look like? They look like questions of how many women complete elementary school education or high school education or are enabled to go on to higher education. How does the productivity of a woman's farm or business compare to that of a man's? What do infant mortality rates look like? What do birth rates look like? What do maternal mortality rates look like? What do all of these basic indicators of women's well-being look like? And what does the wage gap look like between women and men? There's so many metrics that we can use to look at improvements, but at the same time, we have to be aware that they are incomplete metrics. And the more we can actually ask people, how did your life change and in what ways, what worked and what didn't, the more successful we'll be.
Okay, we've got some quite specific questions coming through, Catherine. I'm not sure how you want to take these, but there's one very specific one here about the Nature Conservancy's Agility Lab and women's participation as entrepreneurs for climate change initiatives. I'm not sure if you're in a position to answer that, but...
Unfortunately, I am not. I have been the chief scientist for 8 months, and it is absolutely the most fantastic opportunity, but we have over 500 scientists and thousands of employees around the world, and the Agility Lab is one thing that I'm currently not qualified to answer that question on, but I will be looking into it, and I will definitely be prepared for next time.
Okay. So maybe some other ones, again, to get your perspective on. There's a question here that shows that when women are decision makers in the household, they are more likely to choose cleaner fuel for cooking and heating. So how do we empower women to make these kinds of decisions?
So indoor air pollution is a huge source of illness and even death, especially in low-income countries where much of the cooking is done over brush or biomass that you bring into the home and you burn inside the home. Around the world, it's estimated that about 10 million people die prematurely every single year. That's double the number of COVID from outdoor air pollution. But inside the home, there are an additional millions of primarily women and children, because they're the ones who spend the most time in the home, who are exposed to that pollution. So I love the fact that when women can make the decisions, they do. It's not a case of women not wanting to. It's a case of we don't have the ability to. And I should really say they don't have the ability to, because it's often a problem for low-income countries. But I would just like to highlight right here that in higher-income countries, especially in the United States and Canada, gas stoves have been actively promoted as high-end cooking opportunities, to the point where many people now have gas stoves, and in some cases it's even mandatory to have gas lines installed into your house. You cannot build a home in some parts of North America if you don't put a gas line into it. Well, what is natural gas? It is mostly methane and some higher hydrocarbons that when those gases leak into your home, which they do, they produce levels of pollutants inside your home that exceed EPA recommendations of what is healthy to breathe. When you burn natural gas inside the home, it produces even more damaging levels of pollution, to the point where children are 6 times more likely to develop asthma if they grow up in a home that has a gas stove. So that's in a high-income country. And then in a low-income country, the numbers are much, much, much greater because you're actually burning wood and brush and biomass inside the home. So women are much more likely to make a decision when, first of all, they have the information. And for example, something that most women in North America don't have is the information on the fact that gas stoves produce huge amounts of indoor air pollution, because we haven't even had that information until recently. In places where people are burning brush inside the home and biomass, they know already. I mean, you know what your eyes feel like. You know what it feels like when you breathe that in. But they don't have an option. And that is why those clean cook stove programs are so important. That is why programs that empower women like Solar Sister, which is one of the programs I talk about in my book, Saving Us, are so important. That's why the United Nations Foundation has a big clean cook stoves program, and they partner with others around the world. That's why these programs are so important, because not only do they help with climate change, they save lives today.
Thank you. Those are fascinating statistics that you're talking about in terms of the US and natural gas. I did not know that. So I didn't have the information either. So thank you for sharing that. Another question here around how do you, what do you think would be the low-hanging fruits if you were marrying climate change and green growth with regional cooperation between countries?
That's a great question, because there is so much low-hanging fruit. I was speaking with a reporter the other day who is very experienced in covering climate change and science and technology. And they asked me, if you could report on something this next year, what would you report on? And I said, I would tell the stories of the solutions that when you hear about them, you say, why on earth isn't everybody doing this? Because there are solutions like that out there, and we just don't know about them often. So solutions like what? Well, many people don't realize that we are incredibly wasteful in high-income countries with our electricity and our food. Through efficiency alone, the United States could cut its carbon emissions in half and save money. In high-income countries, we waste about 50% of the food we produce. We waste it because it's ugly, or it's just at its due date, or we just had leftovers that we didn't need. And so programs like second harvest programs, where they take the, quote, ugly fruit and vegetables, and people can sign up to get a basket of that, and then that same organization will deliver a free basket of fresh fruits and vegetables to a low-income household in the same city. In low-income countries, a similar amount of food is wasted. But in that case, it's wasted because the farmers lack the ability to transport that food to market before it spoils, or they lack the refrigeration to keep that food good before it spoils. So simple investment in supply chains, transportation, and refrigeration could significantly reduce food waste, and it could double the amount of food that is available to people. Then there's ideas like agroforestry. Tony Renato is an Australian agronomist who's been working with the faith-based relief and development organization World Vision in sub-Saharan Africa for 40 years. And 40 years ago, he had the idea. He said, what if we just planted trees within and around fields? Trees provide shade, they capture water, they filter air, and their roots retain water and nutrients in the soil that might otherwise be lost. So what happened was he tried it with one farmer, then it worked, they tried it with some more, their crop increased. Through simple agroforestry using no technology more advanced than trees, and trees have been around for a very long time, they were able to increase the amount of food that was produced by well over 100 million people were being fed because of just incorporating trees into the forestry. Here, there's so many solutions that people aren't aware of, like the simple fact that if somebody gave you an old incandescent light bulb, after 2 months, you would be losing money because you're using so much more electricity than if you went out and you bought an LED. Simple solutions like I've always wanted to have a switch at my front door where when I went out, I flipped the switch and it turned out everything in my house except for the refrigerator. And I would save so much energy. Well, now with smart outlets, you can have an app on your phone that you push the button when you leave the house and it turns off everything. You save so much money. So there's so many solutions, in addition to, of course, my favorites of education of women and girls, that are just win solutions. Oh, and they help with climate change too. So why are we not doing solutions that empower and lift up people who are marginalized, that grow local jobs, that clean up our air, that protect us from storm surges and floods, that invest in the local economy? Oh, and they help with climate change too.
Thank you. Thank you for so eloquently putting all those issues together. So this question, a question that often gets asked, what do you say to men that are skeptics? And how do you engage men to take on gender and climate change as a joint issue?
Well, let's talk about climate change individually first. That question implied something that is entirely and sadly true. And that is that in countries like the United States and Canada and Australia and the United Kingdom and some in Europe as well, there are a small percentage, but a very vocal percentage of the population who reject 200 years of science, who say that climate is not changing, that humans are not responsible, that the impacts are not serious, and we definitely do not need to act. That small vocal population, peer-reviewed science has showed, is primarily male and primarily white. Why do they reject basic physics, the same physics that explains how, literally, stoves heat food and how airplanes fly? There's not a lot of websites out there saying that airplanes don't fly and refrigerators don't cool our food. So why would they choose climate change? And they wouldn't reject any other aspects of the science. It isn't because they truly have a problem with the science. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to reject basic thermodynamics. What we do is we wake up in the morning and we go to social media and we look at what people who believe the same way that we do think about things. And today, when people go there who are on the right-hand side of the political spectrum, and this is not only the case in the United States, it's the case in a lot of other countries as well, high-income countries, we see that there is this toxic stew of denial around multiple things at the same time. There is climate denial, there is COVID denial, there is mask and vaccine denial, there is strong nationalistic tendencies, biases against immigrants and against people who look different than they do, and there is a strong aspect of sexism and gender-related bias to this whole collection of issues. So it is not uncommon when I see, and I have my own personal collection of thousands of data points on social media, when someone attacks me and I go to their profile to see what else they're talking about, they typically are saying negative things about women, they're saying negative things about other races, they're saying negative things about COVID actions. It is all part of the same thing. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. The good news is, even in the United States, that's only 8% of the population. I know they're loud. I know there's many of them, but it's only 8%. So how do we have positive conversations with the 92%? The 8%, it's not possible because they cannot listen. But the 92% we can. And here's the key. We need to begin our conversations with something that we share and we have in common, rather than something that divides us. So if we don't know what we have in common, figure out, what do they love? Maybe they love fishing. Maybe they're a member of the Rotary Club. Maybe we live in the same place. Maybe we're both parents. Maybe we have a shared faith. Find out what we have in common. Connect the dots to how, if we're this type of person, if we fish or we're a parent or we have the same faith or we live in the same place, I care about climate change because of that. Let me share with you from the heart why I care. And then, what does a solution look like that they could get on board with? Because where does denial come from? It is 100% solution aversion. They don't want to fix it. That's where denial comes from. Because they've been told that fixing it involves losing everything they have dear, including their status. But when we bring up solutions that really can make a positive difference, that's where the denial evaporates in the 92%. So always bring up positive, constructive solutions. Win, 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 win solutions. that would encourage them, that would surprise them, that would make them feel, yeah, I could get on board with that. And in my book, I actually have several stories of the way that that has happened. But it's really important to remember not everybody has to care for the same reasons we do. Everybody already has every reason to care. Our job is to figure out what reason they already have and help them connect that to climate change. And I want to offer one final anecdote that's so encouraging on this question. Several years ago, they conducted an experiment in North Carolina in the rural part of the state, which is quite conservative. They educated children in grades 6 and 7 about climate change. But they didn't ask the children what they thought about climate change. They asked the parents. They looked at parents' opinions before and parents' opinions after. And they found that children significantly changed their parents' opinions, and daughters were most effective at changing their hard-nosed conservative dads' minds.
That's super interesting. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. In a way, it's not surprising, but it's a really interesting anecdote. So thank you for sharing. Now, we're running a little bit near the end, but I just want to ask one final question. You talked a lot about your book, and I'm really happy that my copy arrived the other day. It's only recently, I live in New Zealand at the moment, so it was released in my region a couple weeks ago. I look forward to reading it. But in that book, you talk a lot about the need to motivate people at an individual level to take on the issues and I guess own the issues. So what are some last few words you would like to say to people listening, or in terms of what they can do and what ADB can do in terms of inspiring more climate action in the region?
Mm-hmm. I often hear people debating, do we need individual action or system-wide action to solve climate change? And my answer to that debate is yes. We must change the system, but how does the system change without individuals? Every single one of us has the ability to make a difference, and it begins with our voice. Using our voice to advocate for change knocks over the first domino that leads us to a better future. Where do we use our voice? Use our voice wherever we are. Use our voice within the Asian Development Bank to advocate for programs and projects that support women, that grow local economies, that lift people out of poverty, that provide access to clean water and basic health care. Oh, and they help with climate change too. Use your voice where you live, with your city. Use your vote. Use your money. Talk to your politicians. Speak out at work, at school, at your place of worship. Wherever we are, we're all part of circles that are greater than ourselves. And when we use our voices, we can change the world, because you know what? That is the only way our modern society has changed before. How did England come to vote to end slavery? How did the United States enact civil rights? How did women get the vote in countries around the world? How did apartheid end in South Africa? It never happened because the person in charge woke up one morning and just sort of spontaneously decided, I need to fix this situation. Never. It happened because individual people who, when they began, were not people who were famous or well known. They were just ordinary average people, but they had the courage of their convictions, and they used their voice to say the world can and must be different. They use their voice to advocate for those changes, for those policies to be implemented. They use their voice to encourage others to join with them in calling for change. And because of them, the world changed. It happened before, and it must happen again. Because what is at stake here? It's not the planet itself. The planet will still be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. I didn't write a book and call it Saving the Planet. I wrote a book and I called it Saving Us. Because it is us humans and many of the other living things that share our planet with us. We are the ones at risk, and our future is in our hands.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for ending on those really powerful words. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I would like to now hand over to my colleague, Noelle O'Brien, who's the Chief of the Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Thematic Group at Asian Development Bank. Over to you, Noelle.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Samantha. Can I just check that you can hear me clearly? Okay. Thanks, Catherine, for sharing those really important ideas on engaging others for climate action. And I think a really very motivating call to be part of the change at ADB. and really inspiring to hear you indicate that every one of us in the bank can contribute to that change. I particularly like the words, the climate change is the hole in every other bucket under the, so that's so absolutely true. And the challenges that we face in changing all of the systems that we're working with. So just to point out a couple of items, obviously, you've pointed out the warnings, the science, the data, they may not be enough to spur action. We've had decades of these, but I mean, as we have seen clearly in the last couple of weeks, that the IPCC AR6 report has indicated to us that there is hope, but the window of opportunity is narrowing unless we take urgent action. And it's critical to start the discussions about climate change by talking about why it matters to us and why it matters for our clients. And again, as you've pointed out, for women and girls, urgent action is needed on addressing gender equality and climate change. Again, sorry, we know that we've already reached the 1.1 degrees of warming, and we can see that ecosystems and communities are beginning to reach the limits of what they can adapt to, and the result is devastating in some cases. And we can already see that in certain parts of the world, it is already irreversible. Measures to reduce vulnerability to climate change must engage women and communities. And today it's been great to see those examples that you've highlighted and how you've illustrated the win-win-win-win-win aspects, which does include climate action. So let's keep that in mind as we get to work on our efforts to scale up climate change. As DG Bruno mentioned at the beginning, ADB has increased its ambition. We have set the 100 billion targets. We are aiming to have our sovereign projects fully aligned with Paris Agreement by 2023, and also non-sovereign engagement by 2025. But this climate finance also needs to be gender responsive. As our intent to be the climate change bank, we also need to make sure that gender and climate is a critical component of all of our climate work. I just want to highlight a couple of examples of where we're now already active. ADB's work with DMCs on a just transition to move to net zero economies. The transition required to deal with climate change will create opportunities for new industries, but it will also negatively impact the society, especially women and vulnerable groups. So the just transition process can help gender transformative change, specifically empowering women and increasing their role in society. And for our colleagues at the bank at SDCC, we'll be leading the setting up of a just transition platform, a just transition task force in the next couple of weeks. So we look forward to working on that area. We've also in 2021 established the Community Resilience Partnership Program. It has both a trust fund and hopefully an investment program. And this aims to strengthen climate resilience by increasing climate adaptation investment that explicitly addresses the climate, gender, and poverty nexus, especially at the community and local levels. A dedicated gender window was set up to support investments that strengthen the climate resilience of poor women. So just again, climate change is a huge issue to tackle. But still, we can do things at the individual and at the institution levels and in partnership with others to ensure that we're all engaged in climate solutions. And as we've heard throughout this week, this is particularly critical for women and girls, and we must remember that throughout the year now. Although the crisis disproportionately impacts women and girls, They are also leading on climate action and are essential change agents in their community. And this is obviously one of the reasons why we're having this conversation today as part of the celebration of International Women's Day. So thanks again to Samantha and her team for all the events that they've organized this week, for inviting us in. And to Catherine, look forward to reading your book. And thanks again for the inspirational words that you've shared with us all today. Much appreciated, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Noel. Thank you everyone for joining. And I hope that you've been as inspired as I have from listening to Catherine. Have a good day and take action.